Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Whither, Psychoanalysis, and Digital Culture. I'm Jamie Paglia. Cambridge Forum is now in its 36th season of bringing you live public programs for the discussion of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. The explosion of new technologies in computer-based communications, learning tools, and entertainment has forever changed the way people relate to one another. The World Wide Web has spawned virtual communities uniting individuals from around the globe. Robotic toys and pets have become must-haves for children at holiday time. Companies use digital buddies as marketing tools to befriend teens and push products. I'm going to say that again for the radio. Companies use digital buddies on the internet as marketing tools to befriend teens and push products. What is the impact of these new technologies on our emotional connections? Does it call for a renewed relevance of psychoanalytic discourse in digital culture? Our speaker, Sherry Turkle, believes that it does. The director and founder of MIT's Initiative on Technology and Self, she's written extensively on psychoanalysis and culture and on people's relationships with technology, especially computers. Previous books include The Second Self, Computers and the Human Spirit, and Life on the Screen, Identity in the Age of the Internet. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Sherry Turkle.
When over 20 years ago I first began teaching at MIT, it was at the same time that I was in psychoanalytic training, and my students, many of whom I don't think had ever seen anyone who was in psychoanalytic training, used to tease me that Freudian slips were only information processing errors, tease me and torment me. So they would take a slip such as substituting closed for open, which of course is the first slip that Freud uses in his essay on slip. The chairman introduces a meeting by declaring the session closed. And they would analyze it, reanalyze it in a very non-Freudian way, using the assumption that the mind is a computer. So in a computer, closed and open can be designated by the same symbol, separated by a sign of opposition. Closed equals minus open. So substituting closed for open in a computational sense doesn't require the notion of ambivalence or conflict. When that substitution is made, as one of my students said, a bit has been dropped. And that student went on to say, Professor Turkle, a minus sign has been lost, a bit has been dropped, there's been a power surge, no problem. In other words, with this brief comment, an explanation in terms of meaning was replaced by a narrative of mechanistic causation. And in the early 1980s, that transition from meaning to mechanism struck me as emblematic of a larger movement that seemed to be taking place in popular psychological culture. Were we moving from a psychoanalytic to a computer culture, a psychological culture that would turn away from such notions of ambivalence when it modeled the mind as a digital machine? So at that point, really in the late 70s, early 80s, that developing relationship, that tension between a psychoanalytic and computer culture as popular psychological cultures, I really don't mean just in the academy, but as these cultures kind of hit the street in the way people talked about their past, their problems, their possibilities for change, that tension between psychoanalytic and computer cultures moved to the center of my intellectual concerns. But the story of that relationship has been far more complex than that narrative of simple transition, psychoanalytic to computer, meaning to mechanism, that had first suggested itself to me during the early 1980s. And actually this evening I'm going to be arguing for the renewed relevance of a psychoanalytic discourse in contemporary digital culture. Indeed, I'm going to be arguing that this relevance is so profound as to suggest an occasion for revitalization and renewal of psychoanalytic thinking. In my view, this contemporary relevance does not follow, as some might expect, from efforts, and indeed as I once expected it to, from efforts to link psychoanalysis and computationally inspired neuroscientists. It doesn't follow from the psychoanalysis-neuroscience connection, although that is very interesting work. Today, the elements within the computer culture that speak most directly to psychoanalysis are not theoretical, but concrete. New and evocative computational objects demand a depth psychology of our relationships with them. Psychoanalysis needs to understand, or I should put it otherwise, I think that psychoanalysis is needed to understand the influence of these new objects, everything from robots to wearable computers to objects that you are kind of bound with in increasingly intimate ways. I'll be talking about all of these. I think of these new objects that we need to understand as intimate machines, and psychoanalysis needs to understand them on the terrain that psychoanalysis knows best, that is the experience and specificity of the sensual and speaking human subject. In other words, what I'm going to be arguing is that the very objects of our lives, the new digital objects of our lives, demand an understanding that I think psychoanalytic discourse can help with. So let me begin with the distinction that I know a lot of you have heard me make before, but it is kind of the basis for my thinking, which is a distinction between the instrumental computer, and that's the computer that does things for us, and my subject, which doesn't deny any of that wonderful stuff that the computer does for us, or not so wonderful stuff, but my subject, which is the subjective computer, not the computer that does things for us, but the computer that does things to us as people, to our ways of seeing the world, to the way we think, to the way we raise our children, to the nature of our relationships with each other. Computers are not just tools. As I've said, they are intimate machines. Some examples. A novelist refers to my ESP with the machine. The words float out. I share the screen with my words. An architect who uses the computer to design goes even further. Quote, I don't see the building in my mind until I start to play with shapes and forms on the machine. It comes to life, that is, the building comes to life in the space between my eyes and the screen. Musicians often hear the music in their minds before they play it, experiencing the music from within before they experience it from without. The computer, similarly, can be experienced as an object on the border between self and not self, what in the psychoanalytic tradition we would call a transitional object. When designers focus on how computational devices, such as personal digital assistants, will help people better manage their complex lives, they focus on kind of the instrumental. Users have seen devices, such as a Palm Pilot, as extensions of self. For example, one user says, when my Palm crashed, it was like a death. More than I could handle. I had lost my mind. So what I'm saying here as kind of ground zero, the first level of the conversation, is just to make the point that contemporary computational objects demand that we focus our attention on the significance of our increasingly intimate relationships with them. We need a developmental and psychodynamic approach to technology that focuses on these new object relations. Now, that phrase object relation should ring a bell because there's a certain irony in the suggestion and the way in which I've worded it, because, of course, psychoanalysis has its own object relations tradition. In Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, he opens psychoanalysis up to thinking about how people take lost objects and bring them inside, internalize them, creating new psychic structure along with new facets of personality and capacity. But for psychoanalysis, historically, the objects in question were people. Of course, there were some and very significant psychoanalytic thinkers who've explored the power of the inanimate, in particular psychoanalytic thinkers who wrote about the experience of objects in children's play. But in general, the story of object relations in psychoanalysis really has cast people in the role of objects. Today, the new objects of our lives call upon psychoanalytic theory to create an object relations theory that really is about objects, things, in the everyday sense of the word. So what are these new objects that I want to draw your attention to and that I think call for this renewal of interest? When in the early 1980s, I first called the computer a second self or a Rorschach, an object for the projection of personhood, relationships with the computer were usually one-on-one, a person alone with a machine. The Rorschach effect of person alone with computer continues. It's not as though this has ended, now with simulation games that, for example, ask our children to construct virtual families with their own psychological dynamics, a game like The Sims. One 10-year-old describes playing The Sims in this way, quote, "I feel a connection when I make my family and a grown-up me." So I certainly think that this Rorschach effect, what I call the second self, this projection of self onto the game, continues, although in new forms. But there's more. Additionally, the internet now links millions of us together, giving all of us an opportunity for a life on the screen that is in essence, or can be in essence, a parallel life, an opportunity to play with multiple aspects of self, something that I've written about extensively, but that I will get back to briefly. Most recently, a new kind of computational object has appeared on the scene, and talking about these objects will be my focus this evening. I call them relational artifacts, such as robotic pets, digital creatures, those little Tamagotchi that you needed to take care of. These are explicitly designed to forge emotive, affect-laden connections with people. They are explicitly designed as companion species. Today's relational artifacts, the ones that are on the market, include robot dogs and cats, some specially designed and marketed to the elderly. There's also a robot infant doll that makes baby sounds, baby facial expressions, shaped by mechanical musculature under artificial skin. And this computationally complex doll, which has been the focus of a lot of my study, has baby states of mind. Bounce the doll when it's happy and it gets happier, bounce it when it's grumpy and it gets grumpier. We'll get back to that doll and its impact on both children and older people. At MIT, a research group called Affective Computing works on the assumption that machines will not be able to develop human-like intelligence without first giving them sociability and affect. The mission of this affective computing group is to develop computers that are programmed to assess their users' emotional states and respond with emotional states of their own. So in the case of the robotic doll, the affective computers, what you're confronted with are relational artifacts that demand that human users attend to the psychological state of the machine. Now, this is a very important turning point for me as a psychologist for two reasons. You get people, first of all, into a social practice, not an intellectual practice, a social practice that implies that machines are sentient and have emotions. Not because you're thinking theoretically they do, I've read it, I've learned it, but you're in a social practice where there's that initial buy-in. And secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, people are bonded to the objects that they care for. Perhaps one of the most, my research is ethnographic and clinical to talk about findings and results. It's not my language to talk about findings and results. Nevertheless, one of my findings and results of studying this topic over now the past 7 years is that when we care, when we are asked to nurture and care for a computational artifact, we are bound to it. We connect to it in a very particular and very intimate way. We care for what we nurture, and thus working with these relational artifacts gives you both the buy-in to sentience and also a kind of emotional experience of connection. Traditional dolls or teddy bears, because I know that in questions people are going to say, well, what about traditional dolls and teddy bears? I'm anticipating you. Because, of course, I study these objects in relation to the traditional objects. Here's the difference. They presented an unchanging and passive presence. With today's humanoid robots, children's expectations that their dolls might want to be hugged, dressed, or lulled to sleep, or punished, or whatever, don't just come from the child's projection of fantasy or desire onto an inert plaything, all the things that made the dolls and the teddy bears these very powerful projective objects. But they come from such things as the digital dolls crying inconsolably, or saying, hug me, or I love you, or do you love me, or it's time for me to get dressed for school, in response to what the child does. In other words, it's no longer just a tape being played. It matters what time of day, it matters what's going on, or thank you for teaching me French, or whatever the doll is involved with the child. It's different. Now, what do I mean by saying that I want psychoanalysis to encounter these objects? Okay, let me just take one example of what I mean by that sense of encounter. It's interesting to consider how these objects look from the perspective of a tradition in psychoanalysis, self-psychology, just to take one. Heinz Kohut describes how some people may shore up their fragile sense of self by turning another person into what he calls a self-object. In the role of self-object, the other person is experienced as part of the self, thus in perfect tune with the fragile individual's inner state. Disappointments inevitably follow. Relational artifacts, not just as they exist now, but as their designers promise they will soon be, clearly present themselves as candidates for this kind of role, that role of being there to shore up someone else's sense of self. And as a matter of fact, if they can give the appearance of aliveness and yet not disappoint in crucial ways, they may even have a comparative advantage over people and open new possibilities. You can laugh. And open new possibilities for narcissistic experience with machines. One might even say that when people turn other people into self-objects, they are making an effort to turn another person into a kind of spare part. And from this point of view, relational artifacts make a certain amount of sense as successors to the always resistant human material. Now, I'm going to be going back to the psychology of these relational artifacts, but here I want to step back and quickly review the context that they appear in, how different modalities of being with the computer. Remember, I talked about one-on-one, using the computer as a gateway to other people, and finally being presented with computation as a companion, how they challenge psychoanalytic thinking in somewhat different ways. And of course, I want to point out that this challenge to psychoanalytic thinking face us all at the same time. So, for example, the development of relational artifacts doesn't mean that we don't also continue to spend a great deal of time alone, one-on-one with our computer. So we lived in a kind of layered digital world where the addition of relational artifacts don't mean that the sim games go away, they don't mean that the chat rooms go away, they don't mean that the virtual worlds go away. We are living in all of this and all at the same time. So I think before I return to kind of focus on the depth psychology of the relational artifacts, I want to quickly set the context of these other two modalities. So, okay, personal computing one-on-one with the machine. I've written a lot about this, but let me just quickly signal some of the highlights. That being alone with a computer can be psychologically compelling for many different reasons. Sometimes I argue it's like The Godfather that makes you a promise that you can't, I'll make you a promise you can't refuse. The thing about personal computers, it makes so many different kinds of people, so many different kinds of psychological promises they can't refuse. It's the sweep of so many different forms of computer holding power and styles of seduction of the machine. For example, one important part of computer holding power is the promise of perfection. The fantasy that if you do it right, it will do it right and right away. Now, some people are turned off by this, but for some people, this is very, very powerful. Writers become obsessed with fonts, layouts, spelling, grammar checks. I see from the expressions that you understand what I mean. A typo was like a scarlet A. It's like saying, that you couldn't take the 1 minute, the one little keystroke to get this right. I mean, it becomes it's a kind of a moral, it's a sign of something much more than, what used to be a typo. Like the anorectic projecting self-worth onto his or her body and calorie consumption and who endeavors to eat 10 calories less every day, game players or programmers may try to get one more screen or play 10 minutes more each day when dealing with perfectible computational material. Because, of course, that's what it is. Unlike people, computational material is, in that sense, as a user, perfectible. Thus, the promise of perfection is at the heart, for some people, of the computer's holding power. But others are drawn by different sirens. For example, by the feeling that when they are on the computer, the machine can seem to be a second self. Now, this metaphor of the second self, the holding power of the machine as a projection of self, was first suggested to me by a 13-year-old girl who said, when you program a computer, there's a little piece of your mind, and now it's a little piece of the computer's mind, and now you can see it differently. That is very heady stuff. to feel that kind of connection with an external object. If you're afraid of intimacy, and yet you're afraid of being alone, the computer offers an apparent solution: the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. In the mirror of the machine, you can be a loner, yet never have to be alone. And this dynamic of companionship without the demands of intimacy is even more dramatic in our lives on the internet, where computers become a powerful evocative object for rethinking identity, and one that encourages people to recast their sense of self in terms of all the multiple aspects of themselves that they can be in their lives on the screen. So let me just say a word now about that second layer. That was the first layer, one-on-one. What about this second layer, lives on the screen, lives on the internet? So in cyberspace, it's well known, the body is represented by your textual description of the body. Even now that you have graphic representations, you still get to choose one. The obese can be slender, the beautiful plain. And even more important than to get to choose your own description is the fact that until now, self-presentation has been written in text, has meant that you have time to reflect on and edit your composition of self or the things you're going to say, which makes it easier for the shy to be outgoing and for the nerdy to be sophisticated. The relative anonymity of life on the screen, one has the choice of being known only by one's chosen handle or online name, gives people the chance to express often unexplored aspects of self. And additionally, multiple aspects of self can be explored in parallel. Online services offer their users the opportunity to be known by several names, several different names, all at the same time. For example, it's not unusual for somebody to be Bronco Bill in one chat room, Armani Boy in another, and Mr. Sensitive in a third. For some people, these possibilities of cyberspace offer a place to act out unresolved conflicts, to play and replay personal difficulties on a new and exotic stage. But for other people, it does provide an opportunity to work through. Here's the old opposition between acting out and working through, to work through significant problems and to use the new materials that are offered by cybersociality to reach for new resolutions. What I found in my research is that these more positive identity effects follow from the fact that for many people, cyberspace provides what Erik Erikson would have called a psychosocial moratorium. That's the time out, usually in adolescence, which was such a central element in how Erikson thought about identity development during adolescence. Now, this time out, this moratorium, is a time during which one's actions are, in a certain sense, not counted, as they will be later in life. Now, today, the idea of the college years as a consequence-free time out really does seem of another era. But if our culture no longer offers an adolescent time out, virtual communities do. And it is part of what makes them so attractive. More than this, people can experience this time out not just during adolescence, but throughout life, which is where you need it. You need these moments of reworking throughout life, because time in cyberspace reworks the notion of this moratorium, because now it may exist on an always available window on the screen. And I think that analytic clinicians need to note and respect and take very seriously their patients' lives on the screen. Because in my research, I've found that the people who make the most of these parallel lives in cyberspace are the ones who were capable of approaching it in a spirit of self-reflection. What does my behavior in cyberspace tell me about what I want, who I am, what I may not be getting in the rest of my life, what I'm missing? These are hard questions, they're difficult questions, they're questions that people need support to ask and reflect on, and this is exactly the kind of material that a psychodynamic psychology needs to work with. So we talked about the individual one-on-one. I said a little bit about cyberspace. Obviously, both of these things continue on in the context of what's new, which is relational artifacts as companion species. In Steven Spielberg's movie AI, Artificial Intelligence, scientists build a humanoid robot boy, his name is David, And what's interesting about the movie is that this humanoid boy is programmed to love. And David expresses this love to a woman who's adopted him as her child. And in all the discussion and reviews that followed the release of the film, the emphasis usually fell, as it so often does when we're talking about technology, on the question of whether such a robot could really be developed, if it could be developed, when it could be developed, and a kind of instrumental question. And people, I think, too quickly passed over a deeper question, and actually a much more relevant question for today, and one that has historically contributed to our fascination with the computer's growing capabilities. And that question concerns not what computers can do or what computers will be like in the future, but rather, what will we be like? What kind of people are we becoming as we develop more and more intimate relationships with our machines? And in this context, the pressing issue in AI is not the potential reality of the non-biological son, but rather that which is faced by his adoptive mother, a biological woman whose response to a machine that asks for her nurturance is the desire to nurture it, whose response to a non-biological creature who reaches out to her is to feel attachment, horror, love, and confusion. The questions faced by the mother in AI include: what kind of relationship is it appropriate, desirable, imaginable to have with a machine? And what is a relationship? Today we are faced with relational artifacts to which people respond in ways that have much in common with the mother in AI. I'm obviously not arguing that we've built a little David. I'm arguing that we have objects which push on this same button when they ask for our nurturance. They're able to push on certain emotional buttons. Think of them perhaps as evolutionary buttons or Darwinian buttons. When a robotic creature makes eye contact and gestures out to you, you are toast. When it makes eye, in terms of believing that there is sentience there, when it makes eye contact, follows your gaze, and gestures towards you, you are provoked to respond to that creature as a sentient and even caring other. Psychoanalytic thought offers many materials that can deepen our understanding of what we feel when we confront a robot baby who asks for our love, and it can help us explore what moral stance we might take if we choose to pursue such relationships. There is every indication that the future of computational technology will include relational artifacts that have, and here in quotes, feelings, in quotes, life cycles, in quotes, moods, in quotes, that reminisce, that have a sense of humor, that certainly say they love us and ask us to love them back. What will it mean to a person when their primary daily companion is a robotic dog, or their healthcare attendant is a robot cat? Both of these things now in production, now being bought and sold, now in nursing homes. Or their software program attends to their emotional state and in turns have affective states of its own. In order to study these questions, I've been working on a research project over many years that includes field work in robotics laboratories, among children playing with virtual pets and digital dolls, and among the elderly to whom robotic companions are starting to be aggressively marketed. I think of this as the Intimate Machines Project. Some themes of this research, let me just present some of the findings, some of the results of the Intimate Machines research. In previous research on children and computer toys, really over the past 20 years, children have always described the lifelike status of computer objects in terms of their cognitive capacities. The toys could know things, they could solve puzzles, stuff like that. In my studies on children and robots, I found that these children described the toys as sort of alive because of the quality of their emotional attachments to the toys, and because, and this is what I really underscore, of their fantasy that the robots might be emotionally attached to them. So, for example, Ron, 6 years old, talking about Furbies. Well, the Furby is alive for a Furby, and you know something this smart should have arms. I think it wants to pick up something and hug me. Catherine, 5. Is it alive? Well, I love it. It's more alive than a Tamagotchi because it likes to sleep with me. It likes to sleep with me. Jen, 9. I really like to take care of it, so I guess it's alive, but it doesn't really need to eat, so it's as alive as you can be if you don't eat. It's not like an animal kind of alive. Although we are just at the early stages of studying children and relational artifacts, several things are clear. Today's children are learning to distinguish between an animal kind of alive and a Furby or a robot kind of alive, and the category sort of alive becomes used with increasing frequency. Furthermore, today's children are learning to have expectations of emotional attachments to computers, not in the way, because again, I anticipate your questions, not in the way we have expectations of emotional attachments to our cars and stereos, but in the way we have expectations about our emotional attachments to people. And in the process, I think that the meaning of the word emotional is in the process of changing. Children talk about an animal kind of alive and a Furby kind of alive. Will they also talk about a people kind of love and a computer kind of love? Obviously, I'm thinking that the answer is yes. We're in a different world from the old AI debates of the 1960s through the 1980s, in which researchers argued, and these were debates that I followed, and researchers argued about whether machines could be really intelligent. The old debate was essentialist. Was it really, really intelligent? Okay. The new debate, the new objects, rather, sidestep those kinds of essentialist arguments about what is inherent in the computers and play instead on what the machines evoke in us. When we are asked to care for an object, when the cared-for object thrives and offers its attention and concern, we experience that object as intelligent, but more important, we feel a connection to it. So the question here is not to enter into any kind of debate about whether these objects really have emotions, but to reflect on what relational artifacts evoke in the user. One woman's comment on Aibo, Sony's household entertainment robot, available at FAO Schwartz, $1,500, startles in what it might augur for the future of person-machine relationships. She says, Aibo is better than a real dog. It won't do dangerous things. It won't betray you. Also, it won't die suddenly and make you very sad. Mortality has traditionally defined the human condition, at least partially, to put it mildly. A shared sense of mortality has been the basis for feeling a commonality with other human beings, a sense of going through the same life cycle, a sense of the preciousness of time and life and of its fragility. Loss of parents, of friends, of family is part of the way we understand how human beings grow and develop and bring the qualities of people, other people, within ourselves. The possibilities of engaging emotionally with creatures that will not die, whose loss we will never need to face, presents dramatic questions, and it poses them now, because there is a slippery slope. You develop a humanoid robot for autistic children, and the argument is that the child can deal better with the limited capacity of the robot, and it's a good idea. And then it turns out that old people, particularly some old people who have some disabilities, and they like it too. And then it turns out that insecure children also it's good for them too. And then homebound individuals, and it's good for them too. In other words, I'm saying that we are in the process of developing technologies that once we have them, we will find for our own social, economic purposes, populations that we think would do well with them. And the question, what kinds of relationships, so I'm saying it's not too early to be at the Cambridge Forum talking about this. And the question, what kinds of relationships is it appropriate to have with machines, has certainly been explored in science fiction and in techno-philosophy. But the sight of children and the elderly exchanging tenderness with robotic pets really is bringing science fiction into everyday life and techno-philosophy down to earth. Because in the end, the question is not the question journalists usually ask me about whether or not our children will come to love their toy robots more than their parents, but it's rather the question of what loving itself is going to come to mean. The introduction of relational artifacts is usually presented by the media, by advertising, as in the case of children, good for learning and socialization. That's what's on the product packages. And it's also presented as realistic social policy, particularly when people are talking about the elderly. Here's a quote: "If the old people don't get the robots, they certainly aren't going to get a pet, and anyway, their children don't come to visit them." I call this the robot or nothing argument. Many people do find the idea of robot companions unproblematic. They say, what's the harm? And their only question about them is, does it work? And when people say, well, does it work for a robot companion, they usually mean, does it keep the older people or the children quiet? Are they happy with them? And I'm here to say that I think that there are, of course, many other questions, because it seems to me, and I hope we talk about this in the discussion, that presenting a machine to an aging parent as a companion changes who we are as well. So I want to end with 2 points. The first has to do with the resistance that I find in my fieldwork to the premise of relational artifacts, even as these artifacts gain a cultural toehold among children and among the elderly. So first is, what are the resistance that I find out there? And second has to do with the resistance that I'd like to encourage to certain habits of mind that I think are being fostered in our culture of simulation. And I think of this as a kind of coda on simulation and its discontents. Resistance to the idea of relational artifacts expresses itself in various ways. One of the ways makes reference to the human life cycle. A woman confronting an affective computer program designed to function as a psychotherapist says to me, "Why would I want to talk about sibling rivalry to something that was never born and never had a mother?" A recent New Yorker cartoon sums up a similar feeling. 2 grown-ups face a child in a wall of solidarity and explain, "We're neither software nor hardware. We're your parents." At issue in this cartoon is the irreducibility of human beings and human meaning. We are back to the family, to the life cycle, to human fragility and human experience. We are back to the elements of a psychoanalytic culture. Now, I use the term psychoanalytic culture in order to turn attention away from the specifics of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic regime, from the specifics of the talking cure, and towards what I call the psychoanalytic virtues. Above all, the virtues of appreciating language, appreciating relationship, meaning, ambiguity, and ambivalence. All the things that my student thought were out of the picture when a Freudian slip became an information processing error. In my view, we need to cultivate the richest possible language and methodologies for talking about our increasingly emotional relationships with artifacts. We need far closer examination of how artifacts enter into the development of the self and mediate between self and other. Psychoanalysis provides a rich language for distinguishing between need, something that artifacts may have, and desire, which resides in the conjunction of language and flesh. It provides a rich language for exploring the possibility of the irreducibility of human meanings. And finally, to come full circle with the reinterpretation of Freudian slips in computational terms, and with the general shift from meaning to mechanism, there is a loss of the notion of ambivalence. Immersion in programmed worlds and relationships with digital creatures and robotic pets puts us in reassuring micro-worlds where the rules are clear. But never have we so needed the ability to think, so to speak, ambivalently, to consider life in shades of gray, to consider moral dilemmas that aren't battles for infinite justice between good and evil. Never have we so needed to be able to hold many different and contradictory thoughts and feelings at the same time. People may be comforted by the notion that we are moving from a psychoanalytic to a computer culture, but what the times demand is a passionate quest for joint citizenship. If our artificial worlds don't help us deal more compassionately and carefully with each other, then in the real world, so threatened, so fragile, we may have to enjoy their pleasures in measured doses. Thank you very much.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Sherry Turkle discussing Whither, Psychoanalysis, and Digital Culture. I'm going to ask you the first question. From your research, are you finding, how do people report on themselves, whether their relationships through computer-based modalities, whether that be a toy or the internet or one of these other companions that we're talking about, do they consider themselves more or less social because of them? And are they being more authentic or more false in terms of those relationships within their real physical communities? Where is that disconnect? And then how does that reconnect when you actually step outside of your house and you have to deal with people one-on-one?
Well, what you get in psychoanalysis training is you get asked a question like this and you say, yes. First of all, one of the messages of my research, to take your question, in its many and important parts, one of the findings of my research is that different people use this technology in different ways. I tried to indicate that when I said, listen, for some people, the promise of perfection, making everything perfect, having a modality that you can perfect, this is seductive. Other people say, ugh, this is anxiety-provoking, I'm out of here. And there's something else they connect with the computer. So similarly for the effects of the internet, similarly for the effects of cyber-social relationships, there are some people who I have worked with, and my method is to see people and interview them over years. So I sort of see the development of their relationships, over time. Some people have found that being on the internet has allowed them, enabled them to develop capacities, to reach and find ways of relating parts of themselves that they feel they never would have been able to do otherwise, sort of like putting one foot in the water and developing capacities for relating to other people, being interested in other people, and then bringing those relationships offline into very fulfilling connections. And other people have this, I'm lonely, but I really am afraid of intimacy on the internet. I have companionship without the demands of intimacy. This is me. And they are on the internet. And they really don't develop. They found a kind of contentment and a kind of way of having just the kind of dosage of connection that feels comfortable for them, and they are there. Now, whether you say they are stuck there, I think implies a value judgment that I think is not really necessary to make. I think that some people have found pleasures in the online world that I think need to be respected. Other people have used it as a stepping stone for developing a greater, I would say, repertoire of personal abilities. And I think it operates differently for different people. It's one of the reasons that it's so hard to do these kind of social science studies where you give out, a very famous one was done where they kind of did, really did a lot of people, a lot of questionnaires, and they discovered that the internet was mildly depressing. That, taken as a whole, internet mildly depressing. And in fact, that interacting with people on the internet was mildly depressing. And when I looked at that work, done by very smart people, it seems to me that my interpretation of it is that in relations with people, some relations with people are banal, some relations with people are toxic, some relations with people are, every once in a while, you have one that's transformative. And if you average them all together, relationships with people might be mildly depressing. I think that we have to really respect that this may be one of those things where you've introduced a new mode of communication, and averaging it out, may not be the way to go. As a matter of fact, part of the reason, obviously, psychoanalysis, the reason I'm so interested in a kind of renewal of psychodynamic interest in this field is that psychoanalysis is one of those methodologies, and people are trained to pay attention to the individual and to the specifics of that individual's developmental history and life history and story. And I think that for where we are now in understanding this medium, really getting that kind of finely textured understanding of the individual connections with it is sort of the way to go for now.
We had one of your contemporaries at MIT, Rodney Brooks, here earlier in the season, and he was talking about some of these issues, but more from the physical standpoint of robotics and technology, and people were asking him to make projections about what was going to happen in the next 10, 20 years, and he was taking some very large steps, but seeing ultimately that we are not only embracing technology more and more and incorporating it into our lives, but into our bodies. Cochlear implants to help us hear, the next step being corneal implants, and taking that to the nth degree, being able to just blink and you're online inside your head while you're having a discussion with somebody and having to have a block out so you don't cheat on your SATs by surfing for answers on the net. How much of that do you really believe we will allow ourselves? And is that the direction that we're going in emotionally?
Well, I know Rodney's work very well. Much of my robot research, I bring children into to play with the robots he builds. I mean, the work with the children that I've done in the most sort of advanced robotics laboratory have been in Rodney's laboratory. So I would say that Rodney's work has pursued two directions. There's you could say that work in this field is pursuing two directions. One is the merge, which is the cyborg future that Rodney is describing, as you say. We will become our robots, and the robots are us. I mean, they will become us, and we will become them, and we won't have a kind of us or them versus the robots, because we will, in a sense, have formed a hybrid species. They call this the merge or mother dichotomy in his lab. There's the merging, the hybridization, and then there's the mothering, which is that we create these robotic companions, and we form that are so compelling to us. I mean, the robots that he's developed, I mean, I've said this several times, but let me say it again because I think it sort of is the takeaway. It's the takeaway point that the robot engages your gaze, gestures towards you, and shows you some concern. And, you can be like telling yourself philosophical stories about how it's not sentient, it's really programmed, and you're like trying to get its attention. So, I think that particular laboratory has really, been working on two of the major directions that we need to think about. First, are we comfortable with the merge, and are we comfortable with the mother? In my view, both of these things are being actively pursued. Both of these things are being commercialized, and the level of public conversation about both directions is abysmally low. This is a very big thing, merging or mothering, and we need to be talking more about our level of comfort with these two different with both of these approaches. In particular, when you say, "Will we let ourselves go there?" We are letting ourselves go there, with very little conversation about our letting ourselves go there. So I'm not saying that there aren't uses of the embedding of computational elements within our bodies. I mean, the sort of that I'm not saying this is toxic, dangerous, should be stopped, and moratorium. I'm saying let's talk. Let's talk about what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with, because it's happening.
You are listening to Sherry Turkle discussing Whither, Psychoanalysis, and Digital Culture. The floor is now open to the audience. Please use the microphone if you have any questions or comments. Please, come on up.
One of the great potentials of technology, the way it's exploded in our time, has been the disintermediation between sources of learning, information, and individuals. It's opened up avenues for people to reach out and learn in their own unique ways and have access to information that experts used to have. And as I listen to you talk about these objects, I feel that it introduces a different possibility of intermediation. And one of the horror scenes that has been occurring to me has been that as we engage emotionally with these objects, we can be manipulated. They seem to be a form of media through which suggestion, manipulation of our emotions can take place. And so we have to ask who is designing them and who is crafting the message that they deliver to us.
I think that's a wonderful point. I would just point out, though, that the message may not be content. I think we're used to thinking, what are we trying to be told? I think the message here may not be content. The message may simply be a buy-in to the appropriateness of relationship of a particular kind with the world of artifact. Let me give you an example. Let's say you sit down at your computer, and it's not a robot toy or a doll. Or sit down at your computer, and these affective computing programs are wired to you, or in the future they'll be able to just be passing different kinds of infrared and so forth through you. They're getting a lot of information about your temperature, your galvanic skin response, your blood pressure, that kind of stuff. So you sit down at your computer and you start your work, and it says, Sherry, don't write your book now. Given what's happening, I get migraine headaches, you do this, a migraine could happen. Let's just do some email, and I'll sort it for you, so you just do some simple stuff with, freshmen, just do some freshman emails, and we'll see how things go. And it sorts. Now, this is not like science fiction. This is not like, this is, we have the technology. This is the kind of, actually when people have an object like this taking care of them, let's say it's probably right, this probably knows what the symptoms of my pre-migraine state are pretty well, and it's going to be right. You become very fond of something that looks out for you that way. And our homes are going to be, we're going to be living in a kind of ether. We're not going to have just self-objects. We're going to be having self-ethers of homes that are wired in ways that are there to sort of support us. The furniture, the toaster, the sensors throughout our homes. It's not just going to be objects. Now, in that case, the issue of, what is the message? What is the content? How are we being manipulated? At a first level, and I think it's the first level that we should think about, it's not a content message. It's a message about what it is to live with this technology and how close, how intimate do we want this technology to be with us. And I think that's the sense in which that's why I call these intimate machines. Computers have always been intimate machines. Now they're really intimate machines. Yes, of course.
Please use the microphone.
But there's something implied in that scenario of wiring the home about values, about work ethic, about comfort, and how people deserve to be supported. And somebody who's designing those things is making decisions about what will sell or about what it's significant to pump lots of money and time and good thinking into designing. So I think that there's a sort of implied content.
Absolutely.
In there.
Absolutely. Some might say, why do we need robotic cats? Robotic dogs? How come? Of all the things, how come that? Who was there, who was asking for that? Who's profiting from that? Robotic cats, robotic dogs? I think that's an important, question.
Yes, I was taken back to thinking about Alvin Toffler from your comments tonight, who wrote the book Future Shock in 1970, I believe. So we're some 32 years later. And so in real time now, I'm wondering mostly about, I had a chance to be with Ashley Montagu, who is a great British anthropologist who wrote the book Touching. And although I'm an applied theologian, I'm thinking of, Soul Murder, the child psychiatrist from Yale, who's also written, and I'm thinking of the children who have killed other children in schools, and that these were computer whizzes and so forth. And I'm struggling to find the real ethic, the real soul, that we're off to the races. And I also think of Rachel Carson's book, written in 1962, Silent Spring. And we're seeing now the Audubon Society, 1 out of 4 bird species is going down the drain, and we have the West Nile virus, et cetera, et cetera. So we have, sort of nature itself or intimacy itself, because this is what children like animals, and they want real things. And I myself have a real anxiety about anything that's mechanistic, because the soul, I believe, is what God is, and I'm afraid we're losing God. Would you care to comment? To the computer.
Well, I don't think that the computer in and of itself, qua technology, is a threat to the soul or to spirituality. As a matter of fact, I was very moved by interviews I did with students of Marvin Minsky, who, one of the great pioneers in artificial intelligence, a very great man, who said, one of these students said, I think what Marvin Minsky is trying to do is to build a computer complex enough and beautiful enough that a soul would want to live in it. In other words, I think that there is, for many, I've taught at MIT a long time, and I'm very impressed by the way in which scientists, technologists can find soul in the machine. And I wouldn't want to say that the computer, as an invention of the human spirit, is necessarily something that undermines spirituality. I think the question is, what's important to us in the way in which we take care of our elderly, for example? I mean, are we giving them computers because we don't have any people left for them to chat with? Why would you give them computers instead of a person, unless the person isn't available? And if no one is available, how have we set our social priorities so that no one is available for old people? I mean, it seems to me that's more the kind of, okay, we have this technology, it can do basic conversation with an older person. Is it really the robots or nothing? Why can't they have pets again? Let's run this by me. There's a sort of, I think there's kind of a presumption that this is like the inevitability, and that is what I'm really saying. That's where it has less to do with the computer than with what we are choosing. And I do believe this is about human, political, social, economic choice. What are we choosing to do with them?
On that note, I'm working on a paper, and I've been doing some informal interviews with programmers, and have found very much that they have a religious zeal towards their programming, and they're very much their faith, I think, comes out in how they interact with the computer. So it's not at all dampened. But my question to you was: so I've been doing these interviews, and a lot of them, like you said, are loners who initially found their connections as adolescents, who were too intellectual to kind of have regular conversations, found their connections through a computer. Do you think by giving the computers more of a feedback and input system, does that take away from those kids who kind of were able to project more? That takes away their input.
Very interesting question. The question has several parts. First of all, I want to make a distinction between talking to other people through the computer, which I've already said is complicated. Some people do great with it. Some people do less great with it. Some people, it's the beginning of really the beginning. And for some people, it's, I don't want to say it's an end, but it's a kind of place to be content. And but all of those are using the computer to talk to other people. I think that's very different than using the computer to talk to the computer. And I think that the question that's raised here is when I used to write about the computer as Rorschach, actually in very positive terms, second self, Rorschach, I was describing initially when I started using the computer to program, where really you as the programmer had this blank slate of computation open for you to express yourself on. And certainly when you play a game, there are certainly games now that have that kind of projective quality. And I'm saying that The Sims, although it has many constraints, is one of those games where you can work, for example, with children and adolescents and watch them playing out issues about their childhood and about their families and the way in which they project these values onto the Sims. Project these kind of psychological issues onto the Sims. However, the question you're raising is now that the computer is not there as the blank slate for you to program onto, but kind of talks back with an agenda of its own. It has things it wants to say, discussions it is ready to have with you. Is this, or even a game like The Sims, which constrain what you can do with it. There's been a wonderful analysis of The Sims by David Brooks, the guy who wrote Bobos in Paradise, and he writes about The Sims as kind of, socialization into kind of suburbia bourgeois life. I mean, what do you get to design? You get to design your wallpaper. I mean, it's sort of like taupe, kind of is an option. So, the question of are we creating a computer culture where we paradoxically have less creativity is there for us to express, I think is a very important question, which comes up not just in what should you buy when you go to a computer store and you want to buy stuff for your kids, but particularly, and this is an area I'm very interested in, very concerned with, is computers in education. PowerPoint is like one of the most used programs in elementary school. I mean, and PowerPoint is designed to make points, not necessarily to open up the best conversation. It's about presentation, not conversation. Nobody ever called it conversation software. It's presentation software. Now, is that the best thing for your 10-year-old to be learning? And parents love it because they feel as though the kids are learning something useful and marketable, and teachers like it because the kids like it. But, that's the kind of question where we just start to use this stuff, and I don't think we always step back and say, okay, presentation software in 4th grade. And somehow the scintillation, I'm hoping we'll grow out of it. I mean, I'm hoping that we're still sort of caught up in the novelty and the scintillating surfaces, and that as we become a more mature computer culture, we will get so used to our special effects that we'll say, hey, we don't need our 4th graders to know how to use PowerPoint. Let's go back. And I think there'll be a kind of return to basics once we get used to it. But so far, this hasn't happened. So I'm waiting.
Hi, my name is Ben Bolger, and I'm a grad student at the Harvard Design School. And I think it's interesting to observe the technological wealth that a place like Cambridge and surrounding areas enjoy. But I'm also very mindful of the disparities, the significant disparities, the digital divide that exists both domestically in America and then, of course, more globally around the world. And when you talk about the sophistication and the impact of psychoanalysis, what kind of nuanced impacts do you see happening that you can project forward with the digital divide, keeping in mind that, indeed, many people living today around the world will never even place one telephone call. That's how significant these digital disparities are. So when you carry that forward, what type of problematic circumstances or social inequalities do you see kind of resulting from this advancements in technology?
I think I'm presenting a problem that afflicts the very rich and the very technologically advanced. And I'm making an argument that basically says we are advancing ourselves into not a very good place in terms of education, child rearing, and how we treat our elderly. I think that the question of what kind of depth psychology a child develops with an artifact that's designed to be kind of baby stimulator to keep the child in a kind of homeostatic, not crying pattern. That's a problem, like you say. That's the very rich really enriching themselves into trouble. I would not be so facile as to say good for the rest of the world that they don't have the stuff that we're potentially narcotizing ourselves with. That would be very facile, and because obviously there's much that comes along with this wealth that profits us a great deal for the good.
Just one quick follow-up. Do we have a moral obligation to provide technological transfers to developing countries and so forth? If we recognize that there is some kind of psychological benefits to these technological developments,
I'm not sure there are psychological benefits. I think we have a moral obligation. I think our first moral obligation is to reflect a little bit more critically on what we're giving and what we're building for ourselves. The mass exportation of some of the stuff we're building for ourselves. I'm rather send out some stuff that I think will do some good. One of our exports, and this is actually interesting. I mean, when you buy PC magazines this month, last month, or on the web, you can download americasarmy.com. I don't know if you've seen, as long as we're talking about more political issues here, americasarmy.com is a simulation game that's an army recruiting simulation game where you essentially play this game where the purpose is killing, but there's no violence or gore, and you don't get a sort of list of the dead, and it kind of it's been boasted that it got a kind of almost like a PG rating, because there's so little gore and no dead, but of course it's all about killing, and it's a recruitment for the army. And I think that the sort of line between reality and fantasy and army recruiting and coming, you bring your disc into the recruitment office and you have a kind of history of by having played this game. I mean, I think that's something that I'd like, that whole notion of what kind of truth in advertising is that, to have a G-rated recruitment game for a profession that, after all, is about killing people. And are we playing, I know that people talk about how we wage war like video games, but have we somehow kind of gotten to a point where we think that the war is a video game? I think these are questions that should be very much being discussed. And I would discuss these questions first before worrying about what we're exporting.
I think your examples, both the education one and where you started with the interaction of this machine that sort of gave you advice about how you should work during your workday, I think that raises actually some even deeper ethical issues about the role of software engineers programming these machines, because your first example made me think that if you become psychologically dependent on the advice of this computer, that it could even be programmed that after a while any scientific basis for the advice that it once gave you gets perverted or changed, and it could end up sort of undercutting your morale and your ability to work effectively. I mean, who knows what could be programmed into such a machine, and yet by then you have developed a psychological dependence on it, and it might be hard to break from the advice it gave you, even if you started suspecting it was no longer true or valid. So it seems to me it opens up a whole range of possibilities that go way beyond programs for killing or using PowerPoint in kindergarten or whatever, to play on people's emotional responses in a way that could be damaging.
I think you begin to see some places where those kinds of questions might be asked in simulation games now. And I think that I take that back. I wouldn't want to. I mean, you're going to a very dark place there, and I think it's important to. No, I think it's important to acknowledge it without saying there's something happening now that's in the same ballpark. Yeah. That is. I certainly think that my question of how intimate. When I say computers have always been intimate machines, I've been arguing computers have been intimate machines for 20 years. Now they're really intimate machines. I think I am sort of asking the question: is there a kind of a sacred space around that we want to sort of draw some kind of line around some parts of the human enterprise. When I was studying this many years ago, a kid said to me, when there are the robots that are smart as the people, the robots will cook the food, have the families, run the restaurants. I guess they'll still be the only ones who'll go to church. And I find that still, people also said things like, simulated thinking is thinking, simulated feeling isn't feeling, simulated love is never love. And these are the responses from really the first years of the computer culture. And the question is, what are our responses now? Right. When there are the robots that are smart as the people, the people will still cook the food? No. The robots are perfectly, we've deployed them there. Play with the children? No, happy to have them there. Play with the old people? No, happy to have them there. I think the issue of sacred space is very interesting. Right.
Obviously, I'm implying that maybe even if psychologists today need licenses to practice, maybe a software engineer will need a license not to do the wrong thing in programming these machines.
Well, there are computer psychotherapy programs. In Life on the Screen, I have a chapter on a computer psychotherapy program called Depression 2.0. And it actually... one of the interesting things about computers, and you've noticed, my whole story tonight about psychoanalysis and computers has not been about computers doing psychoanalysis, computers doing psychotherapy. Let no one walk out of here saying that they heard me talk about computers doing psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. It is that not is what I'm talking about. Okay, but one of the things that's been very interesting, I'm very fascinated in tracking, really over 20, 25 years almost, people's responses to the notion of computers doing psychotherapy. Because when I first started studying this, people said, huh? I need, a person had a mother. What about that? Who wants to talk to a computer about my mom? And people now say things like, well, it's better than a self-help book. Or, if the choice between a pill and talking to a computer, I don't see how it's any worse or more mechanical than a pill. So, in a way, the gold standard for what people think about when they think about psychotherapy has shifted from time alone time alone in a kind of talking cure with a person, an hour, to a pill or a self-help book. And in that contrast, a computer actually starts to look good to a lot of people. So again, I don't think this is just about the computer and people's attitudes towards the computer. It's about how the computer is contextualized in terms of other human social options. Similarly, a computer game playing with a kid, well, if you're comparing it to a mom playing, that people say one thing, but then they say, well, actually compared to watching television all day, being parked in front of a TV, maybe the computer that actually is providing interaction is better. So I think it's always a mistake in doing this kind of in doing this kind of thinking and this kind of research to see it in terms of people's attitudes towards the computer. No, they're taking into account the whole insertion of technology into their lives, and then the computer is enabling, I think, certain sorts of patterns which are not necessarily the ones that I think we want to foster.
You speculated about the rich narcotizing themselves. And it made me think about maybe technology.
You didn't show my opinion there. Totally neutral.
But I wondered whether maybe technology is now the opiate of the economically well-off. And I wondered, you dismissed the idea of the automobile as people having an emotional attachment with it, and I don't think I have, but I do think a lot of people do. And I wondered if you could clarify why people's attachment to an automobile, especially modern luxury automobiles, which really can be personalized, is entirely different, or is there at least some similarity? As you must realize, modern automobiles have seats that automatically adjust to whoever is driving it. They have adjustment. The transmission adapts to your style of driving. If you are an aggressive driver, it shifts differently, and it learns I don't know if you know that. Porsches and Mercedes and BMWs do this. And they have suspensions.
Looking forward to the field work on this project.
Pardon me? What?
I was joking. I'm looking forward to the field work on this project with the Porsches and the Mercedes.
But I wondered if it is entirely different. The cars are getting to be very similar. And, of course, they're all computer operated, too. I mean, those are computers. But is that entirely different from a pet, a computer pet, let's say? In other words, people...
Wait, hold on. This question started to get these questions with the multiple parts. I'm just okay.
Well,
so, no. Let me get on the why not the auto. I suppose I'm trying to argue, in a certain sense, a kind of computational exceptionalism is the way I would sort of technically put it. That is to say, throughout my career, people have always said, why are you studying computers? I mean, why isn't it the same as that? And I do think that my psychological intuition that there's something about the connection, that the interactivity and reactivity of this, the fact that it's a mind machine, a kind of almost mind, it has a mind, it doesn't have a mind.
Adaptation?
No.
Not
I'm saying,
adaptation.
No, my argument, I guess I'm trying to argue why I've tried to say the computer, it's like Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are a little more equal than others. All technology has profound subjective effects, and I am arguing that there are certain ways in which computers touch us that I want to sort of study specially, because I think these interactive effects are quite, it's not the only thing, but it does have some specificity. So that's on the question of why I tried to protect myself against, my car and my stereo. Now, on the ways in which your car is personalizing itself to you, I would argue that's the computer in the car.
Yes.
That when you start to have something that's adapting to your way of doing things, that's remembering you, that gives you the sense that the car is sentient. The car remembers. The car is starting to have it's starting to have properties of memory and caring.
It takes care of you with its airbags and
I
its
would argue
collision
that's
avoidance.
the computer. That's the computer in the car.
Sure.
That's not and I think that computers increasingly are going to be not just computers, but the computation in our environments. I call it not. I want to repeat this because I think I garbled my words. It's not self-object. It's self-ether. The computers in the kind of ether of connection that we're going to have from truly massively unobtrusive but pervasive computing, you're going to begin to feel that your environment is paying attention to you that way. And do we want our environments to pay attention to us that way?
Okay, thank you.
Let's try to get through our last two questions. Great.
Does all this research on computers affect your thinking about what psychoanalysis is or might become, either as a theory, as a therapy, as an interpretive enterprise?
Yes, maybe I didn't pound on it enough, but I am arguing that if you are a theory that specializes in human language, human meanings, the irreducibility of human meanings, the profound effects of human embodiment and human sensuality and sexuality, human development through a life cycle that involves mothers and the triangulation of siblings. If you're a theory that specializes in this is your moment, because you are now confronting a relational world where people are going to be asking themselves, what is special about being a person? And I think that the psychoanalytic tradition, given that its expertise is in all this stuff that people have and computers don't, is in a position to speak powerfully to that question. And I think that it's an abdication of responsibility for the kind of two cultures, we're not interested in this, we're humanistic, we don't do machines, we do people. I mean, it is, I really think that this is a moment for people, and obviously I don't just mean people who are technically in the psychoanalytic community, but people who belong in this larger sense to what I'm calling the psychoanalytic culture. And I really want to stress that. I mean, my remarks and my passion about this issue really is not addressed just to people who've gone through psychoanalytic training, but there are many people who haven't had psychoanalytic training who live very profoundly in the psychoanalytic culture, and these are people who believe in language, desire, the flesh, the life cycle, that these are the intimacy having to do with some kind of authentic connection between two speaking subjects. I mean, people who make this their moment of expertise, this is your moment to speak out for those values. Well, I've made one thing perfectly clear.
Sitting here listening to all this, I'm sort of struck by the parallel between biological science and computer science racing towards trying to create sort of this life out of, what previously was not life. And it, starts feeding all these sort of dark questions about what exactly is the nature of human relationship and how much of it is just what we get out of it personally. And so what I wonder, I think what maybe saves us from establishing real human relationships with not with objects is our need to suspend disbelief, to have a relationship with them. And I was wondering, in your thinking and what you've seen with these kids interacting with these toys, what would allow crossover from suspension of disbelief to belief in these relationships?
I think we're on the line. There's an excellent question. Let me rephrase it in my kind of I think it's just such an excellent question. The rephrasing is, look, these kids are playing with the robot dog. They're saying they love it. They're kissing and hugging it. But really, this is play pretend. Lighten up, Sherry. This is I'm paraphrasing it because this is certainly a way to look at my concerns. What's the big deal? The old person is hugging the little my-real baby. They're playing with a doll. Hello? And this critique of my perspective depends on the thesis that what you have is people suspending disbelief the way you would in a theater, the way you would in any performative context. And it is my psychological intuition that we are on the line currently of people having, in the sense you're describing, a, quote, authentic experience, that they actually believe that there is somebody home, and that they are relating to what they believe to be the kind of somebody home within the artifact. So if I were to think that what's going on now was just one more kind of stage in the kind of, development of projective playthings, I don't think I would be speaking in this tone. And I must say that for many years with the computer, I was the one who told other people to lighten up, who said, look, it's a second self, it's a projective thing, it's a Rorschach, this is healthy. Just because it's a technology doesn't mean a child shouldn't be allowed to play with it. It's a new expressive medium. And I think we are now on a line where people are having experiences with these relational artifacts where that suspension of disbelief can be short-circuited because the object isn't convincing you that it's alive. Make no mistake, when children say it's sort of alive, they're saying, we know that this isn't, that whole biology thing, we know it's not that. I'm not saying that children think these objects are alive. They're very sophisticated in the reasons that they can marshal for why they're not alive, or sort of alive. But children believe something about the authenticity of the relationships they're having. They want to bring them home. They want to have them as friends. They talk about the kinds of friends that these objects can be for them. They're reaching towards finding, without the biases of grown-ups, they're reaching towards finding something in these objects that I find sometimes a little chilling.
Thank you, Sherry Turkle. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, a free public forum in Harvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. for an audio cassette of tonight's program entitled Whither, Psychoanalysis and Digital Culture, featuring Sherry Turkle, recorded in December 2002. Send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, or visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Jamie Paglia.